We're fortunate today to have Art Kleiner with us. Art's been the editor-in-chief of Strategy and Business since 2005. Nice long run. He's an adjunct assistant professor at New York University's Interactive Telecom program, and he's done that for over 30 years. So those of us that have a few kilometers clocked on the odometer can appreciate 30 years at one particular place.
I started when I was 4.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he's also an instructor at the Alia Institute. He's authored 2 books. One's called The Age of Heretics, and the other one is Who Really Matters, which Art told me he wrote as an attempt at a bestseller, and he's, what, a million short of being a bestseller at this point?
And then some.
But he's working on it, okay? So you might want to check Amazon for that. He's had articles published in the New York Times Magazine, in Wired, Harvard's Business Review, Strategy and Business, and Marketing Week, among other well-known publications. He's also the consulting editor for some books you may recognize: The Art of the Long View, Inevitable Surprises, The Living Company, and The Invisible Continent. He's also the editorial director of the 5th Discipline Field Book, The Dance of Change, and Schools That Learn. He's a research member at the Society for Organizational Learning, which is how we got to know each other. I contacted them to help find a speaker for our events. He graduated with a BA in English and Mass Media from SUNY at Albany, and he's got an MJ in journalism from Berkeley U of C. He's got 3 teenage daughters.
Stop there.
Lives in Connecticut, and he has recently developed a passion for weightlifting, which is a new thing for him. So I'm going to get out of the way, and we're going to let somebody that knows something talk to you. And really, we asked him to come here today to address faculty members and others about what is he seeing and what is he learning on the cutting edge of business and what's going on that we should be paying attention to, both in terms of our classroom presentations and in terms of our research. What should we be doing to stay up to date on the cutting edge? And so that's what you're going to talk to us about. We're going to be here for about an hour, a little more, okay? There's refreshments in the back. Feel free to wander around. This is very informal. Art, it's all yours.
Well, I could talk for an hour about what to stay on the leading edge of, and I'm more interested in what we know together than I think anything that I could sort of offer on my own, because, well, let me just kind of get a sense of the room for a minute, if I might. So everyone here is on a college or university faculty, correct? No. So what other, how do I say this? In what other categories of people? Who else is in the room? What other things do people do? Just kind of just to calibrate.
I am the director of the Business Training Center at BlackHawk College.
Okay. Just one or two other, you know.
I'm retired from John Deere and received my DBA here and on the Advisory Council of Business Schools.
Okay. Advisory, one or two other people?
I'm on the Advisory Council as well.
Okay. And most of the people on the Advisory Council here are in some position in industry or business, you know, and probably a graduate or someone who's been affiliated in the past. One of the things I'm going to be saying tonight is that every business decision is a bet on some theory about the way the world works. Whether we know it or not, we're making a bet. Sometimes those theories are implicit. For instance, theory X and theory Y. How many decisions have been based on Douglas McGregor's 2 theories of human nature? One of which is, and they both go back to early Christian theology. Augustine people are basically problematic, and you have to You have to manage the problems out of them, which is theory X. And Pelagius, one of the early heretics, who said people are basically good and virtuous, and you have to draw forth the virtue out of them, which is McGregor's theory Y. And all of us in management have essentially placed our bets on one or the other. We place our bets on one or the other in terms of the way we talk about managing people, and then we place our bets on one or the other in terms of the way we actually manage people. And it's not always the same. And which one you place your bets on, whether you believe that people, that the purpose of management is to, sort of deal with the imperfection of people and create systems and structures that will get the work done despite what people are capable of doing or likely to do. That will lead you down a certain path of management. Some have called that scientific management. And if you believe that the purpose of management is to draw out the innate value that people bring based on who they are and where they come from and what they know and what they do, then you'll have a different kind of management. It'll probably be a little bit more participative, a little bit less directive. And either one of those get challenged all the time, right? Because if you buy into into theory X, into sort of more the directive form of management, you'll find that it puts an enormous amount of pressure and cost on the people doing the directing, and not always to the effect or the results that you expect to get. And if you put your bet on the theory Y side, the more participative, the one that's based on, taking advantage of the commitment and the insight that people have, you find that people don't always know what the right thing is to do. They aren't always in touch with the strategy that you have in mind or where you want the business to go. And you can't just expect them. That too takes a lot of effort. So if one's theory X and one's theory Y, what we really need is sort of theory Q, which is the approach to management that requires no effort at all, and people just naturally do the right thing and the business succeeds without having to put any effort into it. And I guess I'm still looking for that one. That was meant to be a conversation opener, not to be a conversation, not to be a shutting down of conversation. So, but that's meant as an example of how one of many, 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 many examples of how ideas kind of take on great practical relevance. And it sounds like the appeal of this program, that's this sort of emerging program, is to put into practice the idea that business people are continually learning from their results and from each other, and that's never going to stop. And the more conscious you become of it, the more effective you're going to be, the more accelerated that endeavor is going to be, and therefore the more competitive you are going to be, and the more financially successful you're going to be, the more intrigued people are going to be to come and work with you. And then, who knows, places like Davenport or the Quad Cities become known as a hub for that kind of attitude, and that yields other benefits. Anyway, I gather that's the theory behind those decisions. And I can keep talking, but but I'm also happy, equally happy, if others want to jump in. I can tell you.
I'm going to prime the pump.
Okay.
I'm going to do the lunch thing. Talk about the effect of artificial intelligence on business today. Please.
I have to get my algorithm. So in order to do that, Randy knows that I sometimes take the long way round to answering simple questions. And so I'll tell you a little bit about strategy in business, and that will set the stage for for what I know and don't know about artificial intelligence and why that changes the game. And I really do believe that artificial intelligence changes the game as of 2 years ago. I didn't believe that 2 years ago. And it's not that I believe it now because I see something that was there to be seen all along. I believe that now because I genuinely believe that artificial intelligence has changed the dynamic within which it relates to the rest of life. Maybe not 2 years ago, but certainly within the last 5 or 10 years.
What do you define artificial intelligence?
Artificial intelligence is the use of algorithms to perform tasks that would not be possible without the machine acting under its own guidance. In other words, if you instruct a program or a computer to do certain things time and time again, and the value and the reason why you're using software is because the machine is capable of lots of different things. Here is one of the many things you're instructing it to do. That's not artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is when you're instructing a machine to do things that are qualitatively unknown to the programmer. That when the environment changes, the machine, the program, the silicon, the software, will adapt and respond in ways that the programmer could not directly have predicted. So an artificial intelligence program is different than, for example, Microsoft Word, a very complicated program, but everything that Microsoft Word does, the designer of the program has predicted. It can't predict what you're going to write with it. A language translation program or a program that converses with someone and simulates an interaction may or may not be a good simulation. It may or may not be convincing, but if it is unpredictable by the programmer what it will say or do, then that is artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence is accelerated by a concept called machine learning, which probably pretty soon will come to be indistinguishable from artificial intelligence, in my uninformed opinion. I am not a scientist, a computer scientist. I've talked to a lot of computer scientists, and what I do professionally quite often is take complex ideas and try to make them simple and clarify them, and with varying levels of success. And artificial intelligence is one where my confidence level in my or anybody else's ability to really clarify is maybe about 60 to 70%. So this is like a 60% decent answer. Machine learning is the ability of a software program to continually improve its own operations based on what it encounters in its environment. So, for example, a search engine that if you search, I want to know what artificial intelligence is, and you search for artificial intelligence, and it comes back with 20 references, that's not artificial intelligence. Well, the artificial intelligence has gone into it because it's using that to parse the world around it, but that's not machine learning. If, on the other hand, it watches your searches and it knows that you're always looking for a kind of an encyclopedia, and it figures that out from the other searches you've done, and therefore it puts the encyclopedia reference at the top of the list, and it puts other references to people who you've been known to trust in the past at the top of the list, and it weights them according not just to what you have said, but to what other people who fit your category have said, and it's figured out to do that on its own without being programmed to do it, just by seeing what responses yield what type of further searches. Then that's machine learning. And machine learning is an increasingly common component of artificial intelligence in ways that further transform the capacity of machines to interact with people in ways that in the past people have only interacted with other people. So that's my definition. So,
Art,
yes.
how important is it for the graduate in any area of business, management, finance, accounting, to have more than a basic knowledge of statistical analysis and interpretation? I don't expect them to carry out statistical studies, but to be able to read intelligently statistical reports.
Well, I have very little knowledge of statistical analysis, but I'm fortunate because I'm married to someone who teaches statistics. So, you know, I can always go to my spouse. I recognize others don't have that, necessarily have that ability. I'm going to answer your question a different way. I think it's extremely important for people to recognize that the intuitively correct answer to a question is not always correct. And once you recognize that, once you recognize that gut feel is a necessary but not sufficient weapon in the arsenal of human understanding, then you have to answer the question, what other weapons, poor choice of metaphor, but what other tools and approaches and techniques and elements of understanding am I going to draw upon? And I think statistical analysis is one of the most effective and often one of the most misunderstood and misused. So I think one way to parse your question would be, how many decision makers need to have some appreciation for the value of statistical analysis if they are making decisions about significant parts of the world, business, government, community, etc. And the answer is probably all of them need something. How many need a working knowledge of statistics such that decisions of import will be made that don't contradict what a statistician, a really good statistician, would know? And there the answer is enough. Enough people need to know enough about statistics so that we don't get in trouble. And I don't know whether that's statistically enough or gut feel enough. But when we do scenarios, the course I teach at NYU, off and on, for about since the early 90s, is on scenario planning for multimedia developers. It's for basically the designers and developers of software, user interfaces, desktop publishing, media, various types of digital media, and desktop manufacturing, digital fabrication, all of that. And I introduce in that class a number of concepts that are sort of useful for making sense of complexity, right? Because scenarios, basically, how many futures can there be? Well, we know it is possible to know what happened 5 minutes ago. But it is not possible to know what's going to happen 5 minutes from now with assurance. And the further out you go in time, the more possibilities there are for what might happen. And if you if you base your judgment if you base your decisions today on what's likely to happen next, you're going to get it wrong, as many people discovered with the Brexit and US presidential elections this past year. So, and many, many other events. There's no event which you can predict with certainty. And there's a huge history full of fascinating stories of people who based their decisions on predicting events. One of the great ones is the story told in the book and the movie, The Big Short. And so we know that prediction does not work. So therefore, but we have to make decisions, and without knowing what what the consequences are going to be. So we have to make decisions in the face of imperfect information. So what are we going to do? Well, we come up with one way to do it. The scenario approach is you pick a date in the future. You pick the field of activity you care about. I care about, let's say right now, if I was working for a bank, I would care desperately about what type of financial risk is going to matter to large financial institutions and their constituents, which is all the rest of us, in the near future. I would then look at the factors related to financial risk and what I know about them now, and then I would end up with far too much knowledge to ever make sense of. So I would coalesce that knowledge into 3 or 4 alternative stories. Why 3 or 4? Because that is all we have the capacity to consider in any meaningful way as human beings. I mean, there may be human beings who have the capacity to consider more than 3 or 4, but I've never knowingly met one. And we then will we'll try to make those stories as far apart on the cone of all possible things. We'll make them as far apart from each other as we possibly can, as distinct, because we know that if we can posit what will happen in any of those 3 futures, and if we can find a strategy such that no matter which one of those 3 plausible futures came to pass, we were glad we had done that strategy, we had chosen that strategy, then chances are that strategy will be effective no matter what future comes to pass. And so therefore, in developing those stories, you say, okay, we recently did one on artificial intelligence and the surveillance state. That was the last time I taught the class, which was about a year ago. And they came up with 3 futures. They were all scary. The first was what is the highest level of authoritarian government that can, and what will that happen in the with surveillance technology and the ability of technology to track. A predetermined was technology will accelerate in its ability to track and monitor and analyze human behavior at a large scale. That was predetermined by our date, which was like 7 years in the future. By the way, I will get back to the question originally. This isn't an infinite loop of digressions. We're at the last digression, and then I'll sort of work our way back. So we had 3 scenarios. One was the highest level of authoritarian government. And one of the things we discovered is that one of the things we decided, because when you do scenario work, you're God. You decide what's going to happen in these 3 alternative futures, and they have to be internally consistent, but you get to decide the details, and you get to decide what's plausible and what's not plausible. So we decided it was not plausible to have a world government in 7 years that was authoritarian. There was just no way that a single authoritarian government would exist. 3, yes, with satellites, but not 1. And that meant no matter what type of authoritarian regime there would be conflict. And that meant that we were entering a world of heavy-duty spy mastership and surveillance of each other and legal challenges and trade challenges. It was just an ugly world, one which we may yet enter. A second scenario was based on the idea that sort of the play, Thornton Wilder's play is The Skin of Our Teeth, if you're familiar with that. The idea that basically whenever things get really bad, the bigger the wave, the stronger the undertow, and sometimes you have to go almost hit rock bottom before you come back, kind of the global equivalent of Alcoholics Anonymous. And this scenario suggested that artificial intelligence would be seen as a way of solving otherwise intractable problems, and as with the Marshall Plan after World War II, seemingly incompatible groups would come together and look, enough of them would come together strongly enough that there would be a use of AI to solve difficult problems. And it wouldn't be a utopia by any means, but it would reverse the trajectory. That is still plausible also. And then the third was perhaps the scariest of all, which we call do-it-yourself surveillance technology, in which the tools became so cheap and the algorithms so effective that basically we all had the capability of stalking each other all the time. Now, all three of those futures could coexist, but it's highly unlikely. In a heavily weighted authoritarian world, do-it-yourself stalking is not going to be tolerated. In a world in which people are solving problems using artificial intelligence, do-it-yourself stalking exists, but it doesn't take on the culture-changing dimensions that it does in its own, in the third future. Or if it did, then that would become one of the problems that people are trying to solve. So each one of these three were, distinctive enough that we felt comfortable anyway. And since it was our class, that was fine. And we then sort of posited, well, what happens in each of these futures that is plausible? And one of the decisions that people had to make was how much to invest in personal privacy. And for all three of them, that turns out to be an intensely personal decision with consequences. In other words, that was not the kind of decision we could make as a group. That was a decision that would deeply affect where people lived and what people did. And so the punchline of all of this Shaggy Dog story is that I think artificial intelligence has several dimensions that are really going to test people. And what I'm about to say is something I've thought a lot about in pieces, but never quite put together in this way. One of the ways in which it's going to test us is it's going to test our ability to manage a huge amount of data about other people. Our humanity's ability to manage a huge amount of data about other people. And the loss of privacy can be very destructive. And it can also be very enlightening. So in that same class, every year I ask the same question, or I've been asking it for about 7 years. We were talking about this before. I ask the question, I pose a little story. Honestly, this is another digression, but I am getting back to the main point. So just so you know that I do actually have a framework in my head about this, artificial intelligence is challenging us in several ways. This is number one, and so I'm within number one, which is the human knowledge about other people is about to take an exponential leap. And this is AI plus analytics plus the Internet of Things plus surveillance devices plus roadway, everything. So I asked the students, imagine that it's 5 years from now. This was I first asked this about 8 or 9 years ago. I said, imagine that it's 5 years ago, or 5 years from now, and you're happily married, and you have children, and it would be a disaster if your marriage broke apart. You really don't want your marriage to break apart. And yet, you commit an indiscretion. You are seen walking out of the wrong door at the wrong time with the wrong person. You are seen by a robot that is cruising the streets, aimlessly taking pictures of people. A facial recognition program on the web catches that image and tags it to your name, and your cousin has a website that is automatically programmed to post any images of any of his relatives. And so everything goes wrong, your marriage falls apart. I asked the students, is that a better or a worse world than the one we live in now? 8 years ago, to a person, now these are graduate students, 20s, 30s, late 20s, early 30s typically, mid-20s some of them. To a person, 8 years ago, they said it would be a better world. This is a world in which everybody knows things, there are no secrets, we just don't have to worry, we can manage the truth. This year, or last year, 2016, it was horrible. Nobody could count, because we're so much closer to the reality. So that's the first thing. It's challenging our ability just to handle that much information. The second thing it's challenging is the question of truth and veracity. Obviously much in the news with all the fake news stuff. But the fake news, the interesting thing about fake news, I'm a journalist. Nothing is 100% true or 100% false. I've been a journalist for 40 years. I always get things wrong. I never get things right unless I check them with the person about whom I'm interviewing, which I always do, and they get it wrong about themselves. It depends, that doesn't mean that I think truth is relative. I happen to be one of those people who believes that there is an objective truth out there. I just believe we can never know what it is. And I believe we can get closer to it or further, and much of the fact of it has to do with perspective. Well, artificial intelligence is going to challenge our ability to maintain the kind of perspective that allows us to get closer to it. The third challenging aspect of artificial intelligence is closely related to this, which has to do with an algorithm that is doing anything at all worth doing, like translating languages or making decisions about what to do about climate change in terms of, let's say that we humanity decide that one of the ways of dealing with the warming of the Earth's atmosphere is just to bypass the whole question of what causes it and just say we're going to solve it by seeding the sky with crystals that reflect light back. Iron sulfide crystals or whatever they are. I can't remember what exact type is, but that's one proposal. It's been going on for 30 years. People have been proposing, seeding the atmosphere with light-reflecting crystals. And presumably you need artificial intelligence to do those calculations. A human being can't do those calculations. And they have to change every minute, The program to do that, or to do anything else worth doing, it's complicated. Itself is so complicated that no human being is going to be able to do even the rudimentary check of figuring out if the program has actually accomplished the desired result. And if it hasn't, what caused the program to veer off course. That's not going to be possible with these algorithms. It's possible that you could develop an algorithm to check other algorithms. But who watches the Watchmen? Who checks the algorithm that checks the algorithms? Sooner or later, it's turtles all the way down, and some human being has to figure it out, and it's not. That's a third thing that is going to be tested, and a fourth thing that's going to be tested. I'm glad this is all being recorded because I hope it's all being recorded because I'm just making it up as I go along, honestly. The fourth, but I believe each one of these things is significant. Hearing myself say these things, I'm thinking, my God, each one of these is a conversation opener to a conversation where you really want someone with expertise to know it. The fourth one is one that I have been intrigued by enough that I wrote an essay about it. I wrote this essay before the presidential election. and it was reacting to the release of John Podesta's emails and the video about Donald Trump's remarks at that, the remarks that got so much play about what you can do to women if you're famous. And the essay was about forgiveness. It started with the idea that the release of those emails and that video showed that any of us who reach any level of prominence at any time are going to be vulnerable to that type of release. In other words, whether what we did is justifiable or not, there is now no guarantee that what is private will remain private, if there's any reason for anyone to care. And therefore, we who are on the receiving end of that information have to learn the art of forgiveness, which does not mean forgiving everything by a long shot. What it means is having the discernment and understanding to distinguish between those things that are absolutely forgivable, those things that are forgivable with qualifications, and those things that are not forgivable at all. And to recognize that forgiveness should be an act of intent that is separate from your personal feelings for or relationship with the person being forgiven. In other words, if you're ready to forgive someone for a certain approach to emails from one political party, you should be ready to forgive someone from the other political party for the same approach to emails. In other words, forgiveness is independent of any other feelings you may have about the person or any other awareness you may have about the person, but it is absolutely dependent on the context within which the act was created. Some acts are forgivable if they had a certain intent and not forgivable if they didn't. And if you don't know the intent, then the extent to which you forgive them is conditional or ambiguous. And in some cases, there really is reason to not forgive. And in some cases, there really is reason to forgive, even though it doesn't feel like the right thing to do. And the reason this is challenging is because I think most of us, certainly including myself, actually I'm the only one I can speak about with authority on this, but I can say my own capacity for forgiveness is undereducated. I don't have enough knowledge to know fully when to forgive and when not to forgive. The only thing I have going for me in this regard is the sense that I should temper my ability to forgive with the knowledge that it's going to be called upon a lot more, because I too may commit some indiscretion at some point, and it too may be discovered. And if that ever happens, I damn sure want to live in a society that is practiced in forgiveness as opposed to one that is discovering it for the first time. So those are 4 ways in which I think I link artificial intelligence and surveillance and other emerging technologies together, because I think they're part of a single sort of system that is going to very deeply, profoundly challenge many of the assumptions people take for granted about how to live. I don't know if that answers your question.
Art, beyond the technical side of artificial intelligence, link, if you would, decision-making and the role of ethics, perhaps, as an additional linkage back to business schools and business education.
Wow.
Do you see an increased role? Do you see a changing role? What, again, beyond the technical?
I think business schools have a tremendous role to play. So we've seen 3 examples in the last few years of companies that could really have used some business school intervention in the ethics of their decision making. We've seen lots, but there are 3 that I have something to say about. It was a very good smoothie, but it's a little difficult to drink. Volkswagen, Wells Fargo, and now United. Each one of these is committing, each one of these got itself into trouble by doing something that a business school, a really good business school, would have helped prevent if the right decision makers had been able to be in the right environments. The most interesting one for me is Volkswagen, which is one that I've thought a lot about. And I know a little bit about the auto industry. And so, you know, I know a little bit about ethics in the auto industry and in the oil industry. And so imagine that you're Volkswagen, right? You're a Volkswagen executive. And you have discovered, and you are doing, we have a book that I'm going to be talking about tonight called Strategy That Works, which is a book about strategy. And it's based on the key ideas that in any industry, if you want to succeed, the way to succeed is to differentiate your company from everybody else. And Volkswagen came up with a way of differentiating their company about 15 or 20 years ago that was ingenious. And it had to do with their, you know, I think they were acquired by Porsche, and it had to do with the Porsche-Volkswagen relationship. And what they figured out is that they could create high-performance cars that could go from 0 to 60 in a relatively short period of time, and that could really, like, be driven at your command on the road and responsive and energetic. They could do all of this on a Volkswagen budget. They could sell relatively inexpensive cars in the United States for, you know, that had relatively high performance. And people love high performance, and engineers love producing cars of high performance. It's not just a job, it's a calling. And then along come the CAFE standards. And the CAFE standards, and diesel, you know, was a very high performance engine in this regard. And now come along the CAFE standards. And the CAFE standards and other various controls mandate that you, you have to do all of everything else you do. You have to prevent a certain amount of what is it, nitrous oxide from getting into the air? It's not carbon, it was something else that they were emitting that caused these problems. Maybe it was carbon in the end. But anyway, so now Volkswagen has three choices. Volkswagen has three goals. They have to keep their price low, or else they're not Volkswagen anymore, they're Porsche. They have to keep high performance. Well, they have to maintain these standards. They have to provide the numbers that maintain these standards. And they have to maintain their performance, or they lose their identity. They lose the thing that differentiates them. It's not just that they lose their business success, they lose the thing that makes them who they are. And they didn't go to the right business school. So they kind of thought they could get away with it. And they probably, and I have never talked to anyone about this, but I mean, I've never talked to anyone at Volkswagen. I've talked to a couple people who knew the company. They probably thought that they were justified in doing it, because any standard that would force a car company to overcome its identity in this way was pernicious. And so flouting those standards, you know, messing with the software, producing false numbers, was like an act of civil disobedience. Okay, now they were wrong. That wasn't an act of civil disobedience, but it felt like one, and it could be justified as one, I'm guessing. And in the right kind of dialogue and debate, assumptions like this could have come to the surface. And now it may be that they had an insoluble problem. It may be that there was no technical solution that would allow them to have everything they wanted to do. Or it may be that they could have what they wanted, but they had to find a way of expressing it to the regulators, and building a different kind of relationship with the regulators. Or it may be that there was a technical solution that would take more time to develop, and that because they chose this kind of expedient way, they weren't forcing themselves to actually go the full innovative route. Nobody from Volkswagen is in the room, right? Okay, so I don't know for a fact, but I think that's an example where, now they're learning, now they're having these kinds of conversations, or similar ones, probably more accurate ones, because this is all speculation on my part. But now they're having these conversations after the fact in a much more expensive way that has put the entire company at risk. And I really do believe the entire company is at risk, even though it's doing well, if this kind of attitude continues. Wells Fargo is a really different story. Again, I'm basing this on what... And by the way, I owned a Volkswagen, and I happen to have some Wells Fargo bank accounts, so I'm, this is personal for me. I have bank accounts at two major American banks, Chase and Wells Fargo. In the case of Wells Fargo, I acquired the accounts because I had to pay rent to somebody who, it's a long story, but I had to pay rent to somebody, and a boring story, or I would tell it. As you can see, I'm not averse to telling stories. I had to pay rent to somebody who had a Wells Fargo account, and it turns out that the only way you can pay rent to somebody who has a Wells Fargo account and not jump through hoops is to get a Wells Fargo account yourself. So I did, and I've kept it for various reasons. And it's one of those companies that is really dedicated to customer service in principle. But when you actually go to use their software, there are all these weird little frustrating aspects to it. Sort of like Gmail. If you've ever switched to Gmail from another email program, there's all these weird things you can't do that you took for granted that you could do elsewhere. Wells Fargo is a little bit like that. And there's always a good reason why it's a problem, but So here we have a case where somebody set the metric so that performance would increase, as if setting a metric was enough to change the way people behave. We know what changes the way people behave in business, and it is not from metrics and incentives. Metrics and incentives change the way people report their behavior. What actually changes the way people behave is a combination of metrics and incentives to give them reason, motivation, understanding of the reason why they would want to do it differently in the first place. In other words, strategic communication, leadership. Some call that leadership. And you need those two things, and you also need a very, very clear guidance on how to do it differently. So you need the actual everyday people doing things differently and teaching them how to do it differently, and having them do it differently, so that they instill it. Randy mentioned that I'm getting into weightlifting as a relative novice, and I've done Nautilus and stuff like that in the past, but now I'm actually using the free weights and all this stuff, and it's really changing the way I think about learning, because you can really hurt yourself if you don't do it right. And doing it right is not intuitively obvious. And doing it right, so for example, if I'm holding a weight like this, and I'm doing the most basic elemental, the most basic elementary move, which is the squat, and I squat like that, that's really bad. That's I could really hurt myself. If I squat like this, I can go down much further and I can carry much less weight if I do it right. And so there's this constant tension, and it doesn't feel as good to do it right as it does to do it wrong, until you've done it right so many times that you've gotten past the initial part where it doesn't feel as good, and you've kind of now instilled a different sense of what the right thing to do should feel like. And the only way for that to happen is for somebody who knows, either a friend or a trainer, or an extremely self-obsessive individual, to do it the right way and force it and keep checking in the mirror and, and all of this, and not drop things, and whoops, hang on. So that's what they were lacking at Wells Fargo. It wasn't enough to set, and one of the really interesting things, what were they doing at Wells Fargo that was so dangerous and damaging? They were cross-selling. They were taking customers who were happy with them with one product and saying, would you like to have other products of ours? And when the customers didn't buy what they were cross-selling fast enough, they pretended that they were by opening fake accounts and then closing them before the customers knew. In other words, doing sort of the equivalent of credit card fraud. But without any harm to anyone, right? They weren't taking money out of the accounts, but they were doing weird things to these customers' credit ratings because that, and they were doing it so much and so rapidly that it became endemic. So they basically, it's like an alcoholic saying, well, I'll just have one drink. They were getting so habituated with this fraudulent approach that didn't seem to do any harm at all, that it really hurt their ability to sell anything at all to customers. Now, and then the third one, United, well, what can I say? It's United Airlines. I mean, this is the company about which somebody made a video a few years ago about them losing baggage. So, it's just a problematic case. So the question then becomes, could they have been, the question, is there anything business schools could have done to help? The answer is obviously yes. The question is, what could business schools have done to help? Because on some level, what these companies need is an intervention. Right? Their behavior is self-destructive. And can a business school be expected, can anyone be expected to care enough about a company, other than the board, to create an intervention at the appropriate time? And then, does a business school or anyone know as much about business interventions as, let's say, an addiction specialist knows about rehab-style interventions, which is also imperfect? I think these are questions that matter a great deal because I think organizations matter a great deal. I think it matters that Wells Fargo got itself in trouble this way. I think we need Wells Fargo. I think we need Volkswagen. If we don't need them, we need companies like them. And we certainly need people to feel like enough companies are doing things right, as opposed to the majority of companies are doing things in a problematic way that is, when Volkswagen fails, suppliers fail, workers lose their jobs, it ripples out, and a basic sense of trust in automobile manufacturing gets a little bit eroded. And then that takes us back to forgiveness, because are we willing to forgive Volkswagen? Are we willing to forgive Wells Fargo? And I think that's a question, forgiveness is a question that has to be answered on a case-by-case basis.
Back to artificial intelligence.
I thought this was going to be a dialogue.
Artificial intelligence, an objective or a strategy in the sense that, can I use artificial intelligence to help me make better decisions? Or should I rely on artificial intelligence to make the decision for me, and that I become the executor for this massive jumble of electronic synapses that tell me what to do?
I am privileged to be able to say that I have just edited an article on exactly that subject. And therefore I'm privileged because I can give you some, like an answer from somebody who is an authority on artificial intelligence, a man named Anand Rao, who works for PwC and has, was at, I want to say Dartmouth, Dartmouth's AI lab before that. He breaks artificial intelligence down into 3 categories: assisted intelligence, augmented intelligence, and autonomous intelligence.
And the third one?
Autonomous.
Okay.
So for example, there's a program used quite a bit in, by farmers, which breaks the United States into, I'm blanking on the name of the program right now. It's Climate Corp, I think, runs the program, and it's a division of Monsanto. And it breaks the United States into 100 square foot segments. And then for each segment, it does an analysis of the soil, the weather, and the conditions, and it advises the farmer on, how densely to plant, how much to fertilize, all tailored to that hectare or that area. Hire, the appliance company in China, has something similar, where they have 220,000 different neighborhoods tagged by the type of water pollution. And they will sell you a different type of water purification system based on your particular water pollution profile. Okay. Fortunately, we don't live there, but that's assisted intelligence. It's doing something you would do anyway, but doing it with a lot more expertise. Augmented intelligence is doing something you wouldn't think to do yourself, or you wouldn't be able to do yourself, but you're doing it. And the AI system is allowing you to do, is enabling you to do that. So for example, machine translation, translation of a, rapid translation of Netflix is a really good example. Netflix uses artificial intelligence to allow people to, it tracks what snippets of films you watch as well as what entire films you watch. So it tracks by the snippet, and it uses that information to adjust the programming that it's going to choose later, something that would not. And then the third one is self-driving cars. And autonomous intelligence is still, with very, very few exceptions, still some years away, but getting closer all the time.
I
And
just wish Netflix would use all of their considerable expertise in artificial intelligence to make sure that it always worked at my home.
that's the fourth kind. That's aspirational intelligence. And I
It seems like
don't defend
in-
Netflix.
in this sort of gradual evolution toward autonomous intelligence, that's a choice. Presumably, human beings are going to make a choice about whether or not we're going to move from assistive to augmentive to autonomous.
That's a really
And if the humanity would give up and essentially delegate its, what distinguishes us from machines back to machines, doesn't seem like a lot of progress to me.
well. There's 2 different insoluble dilemmas in what you've just said, and they're separate ones. The first is technological determinism. Will human beings ever be able to restrain human beings from doing what human beings can capably do with technology? Should they and will they? should we and will we? And I think that's an issue that really deserves a lot of thought. And even if and then the question is technological determinism, and is technological advance inevitable even if we try to stop it, is a really interesting question that I don't know the answer to. And part of the dilemma there is the question of, if it is stoppable, is that a good thing? And if it's unstoppable, is that a good thing? And in what context and how? And, I would love to find somebody who could write with clarity about that, because I would love to publish them, but I have yet to find something that is really effective. The second one is are there limits to artificial intelligence and its ability to take on the decision, as you said, is it capable of reaching a point where human beings will cede governance over human affairs, enough governance over human affairs, to machines that it would make a difference to daily life? And the answer to that question includes a question, by when? And in what context and under what circumstances? I think we're about to test a view of human affairs, which is that we've always pulled ourselves out of trouble before, so we'll be able to do it this time. We don't get to test that infinite number of times. I wish it was as easy as saying, okay, therefore let's stop the reckless march of technology, because it may well be that stopping the reckless march of technology is itself the reckless thing to do. And I don't know, so we're in a realm of, I'd say they're interesting questions, but I don't think they are actually all that interesting. They're daunting questions that are unavoidable and inescapable. I would like to put a more cheerful face on that comment, but that's the face it has.
Okay, hacking.
What is this, lightning round?
You know, really, who's watching the Watchmen and...
Yeah, no, I'm right there. As an editor, so what you're going to find with me is a considered opinion about a lot of things that I don't know that much about. Hacking is one of them. Although I have a friend, Stephen Levy, who has written quite eloquently about hacking under a number of contexts, and I've read his work, and I try to keep informed.
Is it the human or is it the computer?
Well,
Combination that is
so
broadening the
well.
knowledge of hacking or the ability of hacking?
Well, let me start it with some sort of, so here's one where I don't really have my thoughts kind of assembled in a coherent way. But I do have some things that I think are interesting threads to pull on this question. And by hacking, you really mean, the intrusive use of computers, the intrusive use of technology to ferret out secrets and make illicit use of them in some way, and to broach institutional walls. One of the so there's two types of computer systems in the world. There are closed and open. Well, there's really closed, there's somewhat closed, and there's open. And this is as of about 4 years ago or 5 years ago, when cloud computing became viable at a commercial level. Closed systems are ones that have no connection with the internet. Semi-open systems are ones that have connection to the internet and firewalls to prevent you from, to prevent people from getting in and stealing things, and to prevent those inside it, from getting out and accessing things that are dangerous. And, malware and all that kind of stuff can be stopped by a firewall most of the time. And then open systems are cloud computing systems where basically your system is part of a vast system that others are using. It turns out that the most vulnerable to hacking of those three is the semi-closed system, the firewall, because there's always a way to get past the firewall, and a hacker can figure it out eventually. Obviously, if there's no connection to the internet whatsoever, then the problem is with the human being who, takes the little portable drive and carries it to another place. So the firewall, the complete closed system won't stop Edward Snowden, but and the semi-permeable one won't stop Edward Snowden. So what do you do about the totally open one? It turns out the totally open one allows for the complete and prevalent tracking of all human activity. And it also turns out, I believe, this is what I have learned on a superficial level from people who really know about, people at PwC mostly, who really know about cybersecurity, for an article that we published, which was called Safety in the Cloud. So it turns out that on a really open cloud computing system, if it's been programmed effectively, you can track everyone's keystrokes and analyze the patterns. And every one of us has a different pattern of keystroke behavior that is distinctive as our fingerprints. The rhythms with which you press the keys, possibly even the pressure with which you press the keys, it varies for each of us. It's like a retina scan. And so therefore, then even more interesting, those who are hacking will have some aspects of that keystroke pattern in common with each other that is not shared by other people. So if the system is tracking for intrusion by tracking the behavior of keystrokes, you would have to be able to program a system to mimic the you'd have to screw with the machine and the human minds to such an extent that it would be hard to overcome. You would have to program the intrusion to mimic a non-intrusive use of a keyboard, which would be rather difficult. So, and then it would be very easy to spot as soon as you began to do anything like collecting data. And it would be easy to spot in real time and to isolate that activity and to possibly trace it back to the origin. So cloud-based computing turns out to be according to these people, who may turn out to be wrong tomorrow, but according to these people, may turn out to be a much safer approach. All of that implies that I think that technology can solve the problems of technology. I think enough technology can solve enough of the problems of technology, enough of the time. Actually, some of technology can solve some of the problems some of the time. I don't know if that's enough. That may be, the word enough may be the place we need to land right now. I don't know. How much time do we have? 5 minutes. Okay, well that's enough time.
Speaking of current artificial intelligence.
I am.
There was artificial intelligence 100 years ago. There was artificial intelligence 1,000 years ago. And so maybe 50 years from now, maybe there won't be any of the people who work at this university in this room. Are the people that have replaced them, maybe there won't be any left because of artificial intelligence, artificial learning, and all those kind of things. So, it's been a constant change in artificial intelligence over the centuries. And in the future, it's going to be even more.
Well, I think there is a plausible scenario of the future that looks like an update of Kurt Vonnegut's 1950s novel Player Piano, in which there's very few people who can work for a living and everything else is handled by machines, and everybody else is sort of thrown on the dole. It's a pretty grim novel. It leads in revolution. Most of these novels lead to revolution. It's hard to imagine any other way out. But and then it's the proletariat rebels, and I think there is a plausible solution in which the productivity of artificial intelligence is so great that it leads to an economics of abundance, and people are given the opportunity to work in ways that they find personally fulfilling, and there's an audience for it, and the nature of work is detached from the economic necessities of making a living in some fundamental way. I think those are both plausible scenarios. I think the reality, the real scenario, the one that's actually going to take place, is probably not either of those completely. We were talking about this earlier, and there's obviously a lot that one can say. I think on some level we have to choose how to organize society so that the dystopia doesn't happen. We, being decision makers of various sorts, together or independently of each other, we have to organize society in such a way that the dystopia doesn't happen. Why do I think we would ever want to do that? Because I actually am one of those people who believes that human nature is basically virtuous at its core, and most people don't want to see their own status lifted up at the expense of others. Some do, but I think most people, by and large, are happier if their status rises and other people's status rise together than if their status rises and other people's status diminishes, and they'll actually work towards that end. That just happens to be a belief I have. It's not testable, except in the future that you're describing. We'll find out.
If we might summarize,
Yeah.
which is a difficult task here. I appreciate the free-floating nature of the conversation. Let me see if I can summarize, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. That given the advances in artificial intelligence and in technology, unless we have a conversation, a social conversation, about what we want to do about that, and begin to make decisions of an intentional nature about the effect of things holistically, then we may be dragged into something we never intended at all by the sheer speed and force and power of the changes taking place. So your suggestion, I think, or what you're talking about, is we have to begin talking to each other about this in terms of what it means for the good of the whole, rather than what it might mean for the good in a particular domain or sector. That's the first thing I take away. The second thing I take away is that same kind of conversation needs to take place, connected to that, but also independent of that, on the ethical implications of the decisions that we make. And to make sure that what we say we intend to do is what we actually do. And that's another kind of conversation about decisions that we have to make.
I think those conversations are necessary but not sufficient. I don't take lightly the responsibility that each individual has for making better decisions. And I know that given the opportunity to make the right choice, the right decisions, I often enough fall short of what is necessary. So I have to assume that other people do too.
So a little mirror work would be useful as well, yeah?
And something more than that. We have to care. That might be the toughest hurdle. How do you get people to care about an outcome that is remote in time and space from where the individual decision is made?